Thank you for listening to the Matt's Movie Reviews podcast, available on Podbean, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Amazon Music, and Stitcher. Also, please follow Matt's Movie Reviews on Facebook, YouTube, LinkedIn, Reddit, Instagram, and MeWe. And of course, be sure to visit mattsmoviereviews.net for the latest reviews, top 10 lists, and more. Now, on to the show.
Albert was either thrown out of a car or hit by a car. He was found on the side of the road down in Cabot, Arkansas. Some really, really wonderful people thought that he was worth taking a shot at, and we brought him up on one of those pet carriers that come up with tons of animals from the south.
51 dogs, welcome to Rochester. They were brought here by the dog rescue organization Freedom Ride Incorporated.
This is an ongoing problem. I want y'all to understand the scope of it.
The population here is 10 times the amount of animals elsewhere.
Come here, whoa. Come here, buddy. My name is Monda Wooten. I'm from Trenton, Georgia. Here in the South, it's really sad.
People drop dogs off here all the time. We just made a mistake.
Right. And we know that you love animals. It's not about that.
Myself, I can't tell the difference in abuse and neglect.
We have people here working really hard to change that landscape. And I know we've made progress. And I hope and I pray that I'm doing the most that I can and being the most effective that I can be in my community to make the biggest difference that I can make.
Hello and welcome to the Matt's Movie Reviews podcast. I am your host, Matthew Pejkovic, and this is episode number 453. Out now in select theatres across the US is Free Puppies, a documentary that follows a collective of women volunteers as they try to contain the rescue dog crisis in America's South, in which thousands of misplaced dogs are located and transported to the northern states where eager families are willing to adopt. An illuminating and moving exploration into a pressing issue, Free Puppies also marks the feature film debuts of directors Christina Thomas and Samantha Wishman, who I'm glad to say join me now on the podcast. Christina and Samantha, thank you so very much for joining me.
Thank you for having us.
So Samantha, I want to start with you because it's your own experience with adopting a rescue dog, which I believe was for your mum, which kind of like started this whole process. What was it about that kind of experience that kind of like played in your mind as a filmmaker, as a storyteller, that wanted to really kind of usher you down this kind of road of dog adoption, especially in regards to this kind of crisis that's happening down in the southern states of the US?
Yeah, it was the initial contact of seeing the transport come up was immediately felt significant in just the scale and understanding that Stuart came off of a truck. He's the dog that my mom adopted with 80 other dogs. That woman driving it came every week. She said there were more of her. I started to do research and saw that there are estimates that millions of dogs had made that journey. And I started asking around, going around with this dog now from Mississippi up in New York and Connecticut, talking to other people who had also adopted dogs from the South and realizing that they had very little understanding of why their dog ended up in their home and where they were coming from. And there was definitely curiosity, but also a really big knowledge gap. And I felt like it would be something that people were interested in and something that would be important. And I also started to talk to Stuart's rescuer from Mississippi and, saw on Facebook, understood that really he was from had very different beliefs, very different, set of political values than I was accustomed to. But at the same time, we had this really lovely back and forth about this dog and felt this strong connection that at the time, and we continue to live in a polarized country, but at that moment, it felt like this kind of lifeline of hope between communities that were doing something right and something positive, and a really great example of people working together, on an individual basis that turned into a really large scale movement. So that was kind of what I saw in the story initially.
So, Christina, you and Samantha actually knew each other back in the college days, and you worked with each other as well in short films and such. So, when she presents this idea to you in regards to what's going on in the southern states with the whole kind of misplacement of dogs and the transportation and adoption, number one, did you know anything about this beforehand? And number two, could you also see exactly what type of story potential there is in this documentary as well?
So I did not know much. I always say I'm not an expert on dog rescue, and we went to meet with experts and listen to their stories. Sam knew a lot more about dog transport, having gone through it and all the research that she did. But I really didn't have any idea of all of the effort that goes into transporting dogs to different areas, how often it was happening, and how many dogs that are still there that needed to be transported. And so going down and meeting with Monda, Ruth, and Anne, I started to learn a lot more. But yes, it was definitely a big learning experience for me. And I think when we went down, we did a first research trip and kind of started to learn more about the area, but our story kept changing and progressing in a certain way as we learned more and as we spoke to more people.
Samantha, the states that primarily you kind of focus on are Georgia, Tennessee, I believe. I believe the other one might have been, was it Alabama?
Alabama.
Yeah. But the crux of the story was in Trenton, Georgia. That's where kind of where Monda's from and such. It's a small community. When you go down there from New York and Los Angeles, etc., to this kind of small town, and is there kind of like any type of reservations from people down there to kind of like open up and talk about their experiences whatsoever? Not so much from the volunteers, but for example, when you go into the more rural areas, as shown in the documentary, does it take some time to kind of like have people open up and be open to talk about what's happening down there, especially to people from they might perceive as kind of like being outside of their culture, especially in holding cameras and such? I'm sure it could have been took a little bit of time to kind of like warm up to those kind of relations.
Yeah, and I think it took time to establish trust, I think, in many situations. I mean, even Monda, we met with, and I met her at like a restaurant, in a airport bar initially. Like we had spent a lot of time kind of trying to build trust in that relationship, and confirming what our vision was for the film to her. And I think having her on board initially was really the key to unlock a lot of what happened in Trenton. It is a small town, so at 2,000 people, and she is a very big personality in that town. So without her, I think we would have had absolutely a very different experience. But even with her, I think people were wary, and obviously we're outsiders. We're telling a story of a community that we felt the connection to because of transport. It allowed us to kind of have that kind of entryway into their lives. And we wanted to gain trust that we were doing it in a way that was not judgmental. We wanted to really be conduits to tell the story. The brothers, I think that you were mentioning, that were in a more rural area outside of Chattanooga, who we met, we spent hours talking to them. In the film, there are 3 scenes, but we went back probably 5 or 6 times, and really spent lots of time talking to them to really hear their whole stories. And I think over that time, I think they gain trust. And I think what you ultimately see probably maybe is under 10 minutes of the total running time of the film, but they're very intense scenes. And I think they were only able to let their guard down like that in front of us because we had spent so much time with them before that. And I would also say we were a small crew, which I think made a big difference. I think both Tina and I in some ways are, maybe not as intimidating, or like, I think we're younger women. And I think in some ways that's a little bit disarming to people. So, and I think also having a small crew is very important for being kind of flies on the wall.
Yes. Christina, what's really interesting is that the majority of the volunteers in the film are women. is that comes down to certain cultural issues that are happening there in the southern states, or is that something that's nationwide as well in regards to kind of like puppy rescue? Is it the majority of volunteers are women when it comes to this kind of line of work?
So when we first went down, it was definitely not our focus just to find women, but that is what we found. Of course, you'll see a few men in the film who work extremely hard with the women, but more and more, we just kept meeting women rescuers. And we just had a Q&A at one of our films in Los Angeles, and another woman in the audience brought it up that sometimes men will want to have a specific role and like a paying role in that job. And you do end up finding a lot of female volunteers, not to say that there aren't men volunteers, but that was just our experience.
When it comes to Samantha, dealing with kind of like the emotional impact of this, you are going into puppy farms, some places where it's just where dogs might be waiting to be euthanized. And we're talking about like a large number of dogs as well. When you first kind of like face that, what type of emotional impact does it have on you and in yourself, Christina, as well, doing that? I know you're there as documentarians, you're there to be there as filmmakers and to be as not out try to be as unemotional as can be, but you want to be there to make sure that you can facilitate yourself and grab the truth as you can. But I'd imagine that facing some of these scenarios will be incredibly difficult for you both of you.
Yeah, I the first time we went to a kill shelter, I remember leaving that night, staying up late, going through, and they'll post photos of dogs who are kind of don't have much of a runway, trying to get people to make pledges and adopt and get them out of there. And it's heartbreaking to look at some of these posts. It will just kind of like have the dog and kind of like a red urgent sign on it, and you know what that means. And went home and I was like frantically kind of emailing everyone I knew, all my friends, all my family at home, trying to see if anyone wanted to adopt some of these dogs. Obviously, that's not a very effective way to really make a difference. And I think felt very helpless and overwhelmed. And I think trying to, Monda, I remember, came in that night and was like, you can't. And I think the women were really the ones who helped us kind of, I think, take a step back and unfortunately acknowledge that you have to be selective about how you use your bandwidth and attention and resources, and to try and save the life of every dog you encounter is not going to be the way really to make a difference. So we tried to kind of take a step back and zoom out and hopefully capture the bigger picture in ways that people can be more effective in making a difference. But it's heartbreaking because I'm a dog person, and when you do get on that kind of one-on-one, just looking at dog by dog, it's very overwhelming.
The Matt's Movie Reviews podcast is brought to you by TeePublic. TeePublic is the world's largest marketplace for independent creators to sell their work on the highest quality merchandise. With over 1.2 million designs, TeePublic is sure to have something you love. Christina, it's really interesting in that the documentary not only talks about the present day situation in regards to what's happening with these animals, but also it kind of goes into the history of doggy activism. I guess you could kind of call it that. You go into like these different kind of like historical kind of landmarks of how it's kind of like this movement kind of started. And there was this really kind of shocking stat. I think it's like just looking at my notes here. In 1973, 13.5 million dogs killed in that 1 year. I mean, that was just like a staggering kind of really just statistics to kind of stands out from the page. What was it? Is anything kind of jumped out to you or surprised to you when you're looking back into the history of kind of like this kind of like activism on behalf of dogs? And do you think that since that time enough has been done? Do you think that more can be done? I mean, what's your kind of like a whole kind of approach to that, or kind of like a response to the whole history of activism in that kind of territory, in that subject? Absolutely.
So one thing I learned as we were filming is Sam's husband's grandfather transported a dog years ago. So it's something that's been going on for so long. And then when you have a situation like Hurricane Katrina or something where you're going to have a lot of dogs that need homes, it kind of brings it to a different level. And to learn about that study in the 70s with the 13.5 million animals, that's a huge number. And these women, and I'll say men as well, all of these volunteers that are helping, they're doing a lot. And I think that some progress has been made, but there is so much more that we need to do. It's not just about getting the dogs transported out. Spay and neuter is huge, but also focusing on what's happening in these communities and how we can help either have the government enforce more laws or implement more laws. But the 3 women that we follow are really working as hard as they can. They pretty much all have full-time jobs and spend every other minute that they have on phone calls or actively going to locations to help save dogs. So you can see progress being made, but we have a far way to go.
In regards to that, Samantha, it just seems to me that every time that's like Monda or Anne or someone also try to make kind of steps forward in there, there's that kind of war of bureaucracy that kind of stops them from really making progress. How much of the change needs to be done? Is it cultural? Is there things embedded within just these states? A lot of them, classify themselves as free states and are not really, may not be open to different types of suggestions, except in regards to spay and neuter, because their property is their property, and in regards to dogs, and they don't want anyone, be it government or anyone else, to tell them what to do. Or does a lot of that have to do in regards to political pressure and bureaucracy pressure? Because it seems to me that a lot of times that whenever the plea is made for changes to be done, the comeback is, well, we got potholes in the road and we need to fix first, and there's parks and there's this and that. I mean, it does seem like that the dogs themselves are kind of like put in the bottom of a very long list of things that they want to approach first. So I'd imagine that maybe in regards to getting changes, maybe some type of political activism might be something on behalf of these dogs, might be something to kind of move the movement forward.
Yeah, we see. Yes, I think they are trying to go through the political route, and I would say this is something that we see not just when it comes to dogs, but I think we can kind of understand why people are so perhaps disenchanted with the political system in the United States, particularly on, they see it on a national level, but you see it here on a very local level as well. They spent 16 years lobbying for a county shelter, which is basically to provide just basic animal welfare in their communities for community dogs. And there's a mention in the film of the difference between like a county shelter and a private shelter, where, there's a big no-kill movement in this country. Obviously, no-kill is a wonderful ideal. That being said, someone has got to take care of the animals of the community, of people who are surrendering, of, stray animals. And without that, these women are really filling in the gaps. They did win the vote locally number of times. So the people in the county did vote to put a shelter up. It never got funded. And yes, it was just a failure of bureaucracy, a failure of local government to see through what the people wanted. The women continued, though, to persevere and look for outlets other than through the government. So they're working with nonprofits. They're getting grants from organizations like PetSmart charities. A number of the more successful shelters that we saw that did have kind of public service agreements, for example, with like the city of Chattanooga, they were not just government funded. They brought in outside partners. They had supplemented their budget with private public partnerships. So I think we see individuals working to fill in the gaps with a mixture of, corporate grants from places like PetSmart, nonprofit kind of partnerships. But yeah, it's a public issue, and I think there's a public responsibility. And I think that part of the kind of tragedy, and also hopefully, hope and heroism of the women in the film, is that they are dealing with, really fundamental, basic questions of how to function as as a self-run government. And in many cases, it's quite difficult, as you can see.
Yes, definitely. Christina, with the film out like in New York and now in other territories as well, what type of response have you got in regards to not only the movie itself, but also the issue of kind of like rescue dogs? Do you find people coming out of the screenings like, just chomping at the bit to get some of these dogs in their homes and give them some place for them where they can live and prosper?
Yeah, so Sam and I have been at screenings in New York and LA, and the conversations we've had after the screenings have been incredible. We have spoken sometimes for an hour long talking about what's going on, how can we help, what resources do they need, and how can we help with those resources. And I think that we've gotten a really great response from different people that have come to see the film. And then in other areas where we've not been present, local rescues have actually been present to help facilitate Q&As, to keep the conversation going, because beyond just watching the film, the conversation is so important. What can we do and how can we make a difference?
And I really urge everyone who can watch the film, if it's in your territory, to check out Free Puppies, playing now in select cities across the US. You can go to freepuppies.us. And it's got a lot of information there in regards to theatrical play dates, where you can watch the film. You can also go to @WeFreePuppies as well. And there's a lot of information there in regards to, where you can find rescue shelters and also theatrical dates. And also of note that every ticket sold supports a rescue organisation. So I reckon that's a really cool thing there from both yourself, Christina, and as well as yourself, Samantha. And congratulations to you both in regards to this documentary, because it's one of those kind of films where it's illuminating, it's heartbreaking, but I think really, you've mentioned before kind of like the divisive nature of what's happening in the US right now. And I think puppy power is what can really bring a lot of people together right now. And I think it's a really important thing that you guys are doing. And good on both of you. And congrats with the documentary again. It's been a pleasure to talk to you both.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having us. This has been an honor.
Thank you for watching the Matt's Movie Reviews channel. Please subscribe for more reviews, podcast interviews, and exclusive content. Also, if you would like to request a review and support my work, please join my Patreon via the link in the description below.